Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 77. With nature journaling, we spend time capturing our interactions with nature, most often by putting our observations down on paper. But there are different ways of doing this same thing. For today's guest, Eric Masterson, one of the ways he captures nature observations is by using audio equipment to record the sounds of birds passing over his home in New Hampshire during their nocturnal migrations. I first heard about Eric when a friend sent me a video called Nightsongs, which features Eric and his project of recording the nocturnal sounds of the migrating birds. This video evokes a sense of mystery and magic that comes with glimpsing something rare and beautiful. As Eric explains in the video, migration is something that's very difficult to see, partly because it often happens during the night. And he explains that you have to learn to see with your ears. The video Nightsongs is linked in the show notes for this episode, and I invite you to watch it. It's very special. So having seen this video, I knew I wanted to speak with Eric, and I was really happy when he agreed to join me as a guest. During our conversation, Eric talks about his lifelong fascination with the movement of birds across continents, and his desire to understand and connect with this movement. I think you'll probably hear in my voice that I was so incredibly amazed by the story that unfolded bit by bit as Eric told me about the different methods he had used in an attempt to understand and be part of this migratory journey. Let's listen. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me on the podcast today.
It's my pleasure.
So I came to your work through this beautiful video called Nightsongs, and we will get to that in our conversation. But I always begin my podcasts by chatting about the early life of my guest and how nature came to be such a strong part of their lives. And I'm wondering about you, and I heard that you were a birder from age 11, and I wonder how it all started. Did you have a mentor that encouraged you? How did it all begin for you?
Yeah, so I grew up in Ireland. I'm 54 years old, and I grew up in Dublin, and I grew up in the suburbs. And I think of the suburbs as kind of neither one nor the other. It doesn't have the amenities of the city and all of the vibrancy of a city, and it doesn't have, it's just it's devoid of the beauty and the amenity of the country, and it's really I never liked it. But I lived there in the suburbs for 30 years, and so I was always drawn to the greenery, the grey concrete jungle that the suburbs in Dublin. I grew up in Dublin, Ireland. The grey concrete jungle that is, and Dublin's a big city of about 1 million people, has green ribbons, river corridors and parks and so forth. And so I always was drawn to that. And so that was my earliest experience. When I was 11, a childhood friend, Mick Brown, we had my father and my mother and dad had a country house out in County Wicklow. And Mick Brown, a childhood friend, and he would have, I guess, been about 13. I was 11. And he was a birder. And he said, Eric, God bless me, because I would never have thought to ask if I was 13, I wouldn't have thought to ask another 13-year-old, you want to go birding? Because it was so uncool. But God bless him, he said, hey, I'm a birder. Do you want me to take you birding? Let's go look at some birds. And so I said, sure. Because Mick was a great guy. I still keep in touch with him. And so we just went out some back fields behind the cottage that my parents owned. And he pointed out, I can still remember the bird. It's funny, there's so much of my childhood that is just is forgotten. I can't remember. And yet I have vivid memories that stand out. And I can distinctly remember him pointing out a goldcrest, which is a tiny little, it's actually the smallest bird in Europe. He pointed at a goldcrest, and he pointed at a pied whitetail, and he pointed at a fieldfare. Fieldfare is kind of a thrush, like a blackbird. And I just remember
Mm.
thinking, wow, it's such an odd thing for me to think about because I mean, intellectually, sure, I knew there were different species of birds. Before that day, that fateful day from in my life, I knew that there were different species of birds, but I guess I just knew it in a different way. And so when he showed me those three different species,
Mm.
kind of a light bulb went off where I realized A, that there was a cast of characters and each individual in the cast had its own life story, had its own voice, had its own plumage. And I was just, I guess some kids collect baseball cards in the US, some kids follow football. I just was hooked there and then. And that was 11. And so I'm 54 now. So 42 years of basically,
Yeah.
with a little break in my 20s when pubs and girls and so forth.
Yes.
I
Yes, of course.
yeah, but by and large, it's been a thread throughout my entire life.
And isn't it incredible that one day, one person, one
Yeah,
introduction can change the trajectory of your entire life?
yeah, yeah, very much so. Because it did. I mean, who knows where I would have gone. But when I was 28, I went back to college because up till 28, you finish school in Ireland, you finish school about 18 generally. When you do your leaving cert, some countries they call it the A levels. And so between 18 and 28, I worked in industry and I hated it. It was completely the wrong choice
Mhm.
for me, but I was just kind of, uh, lost, I guess you could say. And at 28, I
Mm.
realized I can't do this anymore. So actually, at 26, I realized I can't do this anymore. And I took off for 2 years, essentially birding in Africa for 2 years. And
Wow.
then I went back to college to study zoology because if you're called and if you have
Yes.
something that won't let you go, you eventually get drawn back into it. And so I went back to college, and who knows where I would have gone, but for that one day when I was 11. But yeah, it's on those fateful happenstances do our lives unfold.
Mm-mm. And in this beautiful video through which I learned about your work, there's a lovely thread, which is that young Eric had a globe and a field guide and was able to travel with the birds through these tools. And I imagine you in the suburbs of Dublin and imagining things and wondering about the world and being able to do that through the bird migrations. And I just think that's a beautiful image. And I wonder how that felt, knowing there's a big world out there that's bigger than your experience, but maybe you'd see it one day.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I think we had color TV for the entirety of my childhood. I don't think I grew up in the black and white era. But my experience, we had enough money as a family that my dad and mom, they were I had my mom's still alive. My dad passed about 10 years ago, but my parents, my mom still is fantastic, and they did the best they could with the resources they had. And they would, we certainly weren't wealthy, but we had enough money that they would pack us into the car and drive to the Alps or drive to the Pyrenees. And so every year we got a
Mhm.
foreign holiday. So I won't say that I didn't have exposure to other countries, but when you have a TV and you see the really, the big wide world, a lot of our cultural influence came from the US. And so I was aware of the world that lay beyond my four walls, beyond my house. But birds for me just extended that. I mean, I remember growing up, I had these ideas about how you would get. I mean, I knew I cycled a bike to school,
Mhm.
and I knew how you would. I had a certain knowledge of the network of roads that probably extended out to Dublin and not much beyond, and that's why I knew how to get from A to B. I don't remember wondering how you get beyond that. At what stage would you turn right on such and such a road, and then left on such and such a road before you got to, France or America or wherever. I just had this idea that traveling, that journeying well beyond the world that I knew, and so birds were kind of like a because I hadn't been to the US, I hadn't been to Asia, I hadn't been to Australia. I could read about these places and identify with them through the birds that lived there part of the year
Mm.
and lived the other part of the year in Dublin. And it was just a way to explore the world.
Mm-mm.
And so I remember the swifts. I mean, I mentioned in that piece, in that video piece, I mentioned chimneys or common swifts. I'm sorry, common swifts. And, if you can imagine a kid who really loves green, trees and fields, and he's in suburban Dublin looking out his window onto a concrete road. And then every year in May, the sound of the returning swifts, which represent everything that he loves, and it's
Mm-mm.
there from May to September. And it's just, there was, I guess you could say, a love affair with the sound. And to this day, I have a
Yeah.
great affinity. One of the things I do now is I've got a project where I listen to nocturnal migration, essentially migrating birds pass north and south every year over my house, over your house. And so I try and tune into that with audio equipment that I have, just to identify and be one with that natural heartbeat of the planet that I share with these creatures. So
Mm.
yeah, to this day, I've got a real connection with the sound, as well as the sight of these migratory birds. And so that movement of birds, that freedom of birds, has been with me my entire life.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about this project of recording the sound because when I saw this little video that you co-created, I guess it made me realize I've never thought about migratory birds and what time of day they migrate and even navigating by the stars, as you say. That's something that blew my mind because I hadn't thought about it. And I wonder how this project of recording the nocturnal sounds began and how you go about it, all the details of this beautiful project.
So when I grew up in Ireland, and I lived there till I was about 30. And Ireland is at the western periphery, as everyone knows, it's at the western periphery of Europe.
Mhm.
And so there's a biological constant. I can't remember the biologist it's named after, but this is essentially this law that land masses have, based on the size of the land mass, they generally similar size land masses will have similar abundances of wildlife. And so
Okay.
the continent of Europe has about 800 species. It's about the same as the continent of North America. And the farther away you get from the center of the continent to the periphery, the more depauperate the fauna becomes. So there are fewer birds at the edge of the continent than there are fewer species than there is in the center.
Okay.
And the abundance is reduced also. And so what that meant for me growing up in Ireland is we just didn't have the huge numbers of birds migrating north and south that you would get if you were in France or Belgium or Italy or whatnot, in terms of
Mhm.
lower abundance and lower numbers. And so when I came to the US, the east coast of the US, for reasons that are too detailed to go into now, but the east coast of the US has very, very high numbers of migrant birds, both in abundance and species. And there's one species in particular called a broad-winged hawk that migrates south in vast numbers. It's a very common species of hawk. It breeds from Canada south to the Gulf states, east of the Mississippi. So it breeds in the eastern half of the U.S. And the entire population, and there are millions of them. The world population. They only breed in North America. The world population is probably 2 or 3 million, something like that. And the entire population vacates North America for South America every year. And so you have this mass
Yeah.
exodus, and they're a really special bird for a number of reasons. Migration is hard to witness because it mostly happens at night, and it mostly happens under the cover of darkness, very often over the ocean, and
Mhm.
with birds spread out over great expanse. And so it's a hard thing to witness. Broad-winged hawks buck that trend. They're essentially they're diurnal migrants, so they migrate during the day. So you've got that. They funnel together into leading lines, and so they follow in where I live. They follow the Appalachian Mountains because that's where they get updrafts and thermals to gain lift. So they follow the mountain south, and so you've got this phenomenon of migration. Instead of at night, it's during the day, and now you have this population that it's squeezed into a narrow leading line. So that's your second thing, and the third thing is they have a really narrow window where they just migrate. Instead of some species of hawk that migrates south over 3 months, broad-winged hawks in New England, they migrate out of the region in essentially 2 or 3 weeks. And so everything is
Wow.
compressed. And so what that means is you can be on a mountaintop near me, about 10 or 15 minutes where I live, and you can see, on a good day, you might see 5,000 of these birds passing overhead. And so that was an
Wow.
experience that I'd never had in Ireland, never ever had. So I just was when I moved to this country when I was 32, I was exposed to this incredible movement of birds that I had read about before, but I never seen it on a massive scale before, and so I was
Mhm.
just blown away. And I just wanted to experience it as best I could. So in 2016, and well, actually in 20, I think it was 2015. In 2015, I flew down to Costa Rica. And if you think of the U.S., the shape of the continental United States, Central America, and South America, it's essentially like a funnel. So you have this
Mhm.
huge North American continent that essentially narrows into this isthmus of Central America, and it's just like a funnel. And so if you imagine all of these birds migrating south from North America, and for birds that don't like to cross water, and broad-winged hawks do not like to cross water because they, as I mentioned, they rely on updrafts. I like to think of them as the Prius of the bird world. Do you have Priuses in Australia?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, we do. So the Prius of the bird, what I mean by that is, if you're going to fly to South America under your own steam, or if you're going to walk, or if you're going to run, or whatever, it's you're going to try and do it in as an energy efficient way as possible,
Mhm.
because you're going to spend a lot of gas getting from North America to South America. And so if you're a bird, gas comes in the form of food that you
Mm.
recharge your batteries with. And so they figured out this really neat strategy to get from North to South America by essentially harnessing updrafts and thermals. And so they don't really flap that much. They like I said, they harness thermals. So they don't like to cross water because there's no thermal activity, or there's very limited thermal activity over water. So birds like broad-winged hawks that rely on thermal updrafts, they don't get those on water. So essentially, if you imagine a landmass full of millions of birds that have to follow the landmass, and the landmass is shaped like a funnel, you can imagine what
Mhm.
happens when you get to Central America. So there are points in Mexico and farther south in Costa Rica where, on a good day in New Hampshire, which is very close to Canada, on a good day in New Hampshire, I might, in mid-September, I might get 2, 3, 4,000 hawks flying overhead in a day. There's a place in Mexico where you might get 500,000 in a single
Wow.
day. It's just incredible. And we read about these. These are the kind of things you read about from days of yore. A lot, we've lost
Mhm.
because we've had so much loss of biodiversity. We've lost a lot of those things,
Mm.
but that's still that we still have that with hawk migration in the U.S. These vast numbers of birds. And so I flew down in 2015, I'm sorry, to Costa Rica to witness this migration. And I had this kind of epiphany that I was really missing what this journey was about. That the journey, where I like to think of the path that these birds fly. That where there's a path, there's a story. And I felt
Mhm.
like, by being in New Hampshire and jumping on a plane and flying down to Costa Rica, I was missing the journey. So I resolved there and then to try and follow that journey myself, to get a sense of what it means to, as best as I could, because I can't fly, as best as I could. What does it mean to live your life in your summer in North America, in New
Yeah.
Hampshire, and spend your winter in Brazil, and to get from one place to the other under your own power? So I spent some time thinking about how I was going to do this. I couldn't fly. Walking would take way too long. I thought about a motorbike, but a motorbike for me was missing the point, because these birds do it under. It's essentially the bird and the feathers on its back, and the sun. The sun that heats up the landmass. And so I thought, well, I'm going to cycle it. I'll cycle it because that'll at least try and keep me. I'll be on their time frame, and I'll be doing it under my own power. So in 2016, I essentially am where I'm talking to you now. I'm in Hancock, New Hampshire. I jumped on my bike in I think it was September 5th, 2016, and I started cycling after three of these broad-winged hawks that had satellite transmitters on them. So they would drop point every day. The satellite transmitters were programmed to drop a GPS point every day. And I had my iPhone, which was, I'd get the points on my iPhone, and I started following them south.
Oh my goodness.
And it took about 6 months, about 3 months in the US. I got to the Texas border, and then another 3 months, and I ran out of time and I ran out of money, and I had to quit by the time I got to Panama. But I got to the Panama Canal about 6,000
That's
miles
amazing.
later.
Oh
So,
my goodness.
for me, that was just. I guess the reason I'm telling you this is I've just been fascinated with. I mean, the birding community it's a huge tent. There are all sorts of people who are interested in birds for all sorts of
Mm.
reasons, and people have this kind of stereotypical idea of what birders are all about. But And I love birds. I love seeing new species and so forth. I'd love to go to Australia to see the cool stuff you've got there. But I just am fascinated with migration and the movement and the freedom. I think
Mm-hmm.
if any of your listeners, if there's any therapists out there, they're probably thinking this guy needs some serious therapy, because for me, I really relate to birds through the absolute freedom they have. It's
Yes.
just wonderful. So that really kick-started my work that I'm doing now, where I'm focusing on the movement of birds. I don't even use the word migration, just the movement. And shall I keep talking because the story keeps going?
Yeah, please. Stories are great for podcasts.
Yeah. So I was when I was cycling through Texas on this journey, I got connected. Long story short, I got connected with a hang gliding school, and I knew nothing about hang gliding. I mean, I knew so little about hang gliding that I thought it was called hand gliding, HAND. I had no idea about it, and so I got connected with this hang gliding school, I, long story short, I found out that hang gliders essentially operate the same way that broad-winged hawks do. They're
Mhm,
non-motorized aircraft, and they stay aloft on the grace of thermals and updrafts.
mhm, mhm.
And so I thought, well, this is kind of fascinating. I'm really interested in this movement of these hawks, of birds in general. I'm interested in migration, the larger concept of migration. But I can't do it at night. I cycled a bike, and that was really great. But I'm really, it's kind of like I had an itch that I hadn't fully scratched, and so I
Mm.
got involved. Like when I got back from Panama in March, and so I left here in September of 2016, and I reached the Panama Canal in March, I think it was, of 2017, and then I flew home, and by June I was enrolled in a hang gliding school in just up the road from where I live in New Hampshire. I enrolled in a hang gliding school because I really wanted to. I don't know how stupid I sound, but I don't care. This is my story. I
No,
really
it's
want.
incredible.
I really wanted to. I wanted to scratch this itch.
Mm-mm.
So hang gliding is a rated sport. You can't just go into a store and buy a hang glider. You have to have a rating. So I had to qualify through this school to get my stripes, so to speak.
Mhm.
And for the next 4 years, from 2017 to 2020, essentially, I worked on getting my advanced rating in hang gliding. And I guess I had this idea that I didn't know. I think I really didn't think it was possible. I mean, there is a group of hang glider pilots that have done a Gulf Coast to Canada hang gliding for 2 years now in a row. They've done a Gulf Coast to Canada transcontinental journey in hang glider. So I knew that
Wow.
it could be done cross country, but I knew it would be incredibly difficult. And so I didn't bother focusing on the end question of whether I'd be
Mm-mm.
able to do it or not. I just thought I'm going to put one foot in front of the other. And so the first thing I need to do is get qualified as a hang glider pilot, and then I need to get my skills up and so forth. And so by the time 2020 rolled around, I was working on going cross country, just small, 10 miles, 15 miles,
Mhm, mhm.
20 miles. I mean, cross country in a hang glider, the world record it's set in Texas, and it's 470 miles. So this is completely non-motorized, getting towed up by an airplane, and then you release and you basically go searching for thermals and keep going
Mhm.
as far as you can. And that's essentially how broad-winged hawks fly. And so that's I wasn't particularly interested in hang gliding per se. I wanted to just see the world
To
from
have the
that
same
side.
experience.
Yeah, to have the same
Yeah.
experience and get better understand the journey from their perspective. So that's where I was in 2020. I got to a place where I was starting to do small cross country trips, and then I crashed and I almost killed myself.
Oh,
I broke my back, I broke my neck, I broke my arm, I broke my leg, I broke my hand, I broke my foot, I broke my collarbone, I broke 3 ribs, and I had a serious brain injury. And so,
oh, Eric. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
yeah. So it was, but I'm really in a good place. I mean, I'm sitting here talking to you. I made a miraculous recovery.
Mhm.
Um, that's all I can say. I mean, I was in hospital for a month, and I was in rehab for another month, and I've now essentially more or less made 100% recovery.
Wow.
And So what I'm working on now. My wife has asked me rather nicely never to hang glide again, and I thought that was an extremely fair
I
request.
bet.
Yeah.
Yes.
So because I realize that I'm making decisions that affect more than just
Yeah.
me. So I've agreed
Yes.
I will never do it again.
Mhm.
And so I got what I wanted out of it. I got the experience. I got to do a little
Mm.
bit of cross country, and the other stuff will just have to wait for another lifetime. And I'm working on trying to experience that aspect of their lives, of that
Mm.
journeying, of that freedom. I'm trying to experience that now through writing, and so I'm working on a written project about their journey through my their journey through my journey. I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And so then the recording of their nocturnal sounds was another way of experiencing their journey.
Yeah. So I have a lot of time I got to use up, and so I can't fly anymore. So I again, it's in service of trying to. And if your listeners take anything from this story, it's just how absolutely awesome these creatures are, and how much we can um, learn from them, and how much we can just get just the simplest enjoyment from just
Mhm.
from being at one with these amazing creatures that are around us. And so it's an effort to do that. I think I referenced this in the video that most people's experience of migration is they get up on a May morning, and they're having their cup of coffee, and they look out the window at their bird feeder, and there's a new species of bird
Yeah.
that wasn't there yesterday,
Yeah.
and that's their experience of migration. That the warbler that they heard today, or the thrush they heard today, or the hummingbird that's at their bird feeder wasn't there yesterday. And again, just like flying with the hawks, how can I be part of the journey? And so, whatever about flying with the hawks during the day, I can guarantee you, I'm not going to be flying at night. Those days are gone. So I thought, well, maybe there's an element of tuning. Maybe there's some way to connect with this nocturnal migration in another way. And so, a lot of these birds, they call when they're flying north or south in the fall.
Mm.
Just
Mm.
not songs, just very brief calls, chip notes. And so I put out I have basically a mic and a parabola, and it's essentially an ear pointed at the sky. And I put that out in my backyard in start in mid March. Migration in it's remarkable how much of our year is defined by movement. Migration
Mm.
starts essentially the first birds to move north in the spring in New Hampshire. The first birds start moving north in late February, and the last birds to arrive don't get here till early June. So late February to early June in the spring, and then the first birds are moving south in the fall, late July, and the last birds to move south they're still moving in early November. So migration is a huge window. So I put my equipment out in March, and I go through late May, and I just collect their sounds, and it's kind of like a guest book.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to come of the data. I mean, I made that video. I don't know. Right now I'm collecting the data. I don't know what, and I'm not
Mhm.
the only. I don't want to pretend that I'm the only person who does this, or that
Mhm.
somehow discovered this. This is a well-known phenomenon. I just connect with it in a way that resonates, and
Mm-mm.
for me, to be honest, it's almost secondarily important to study the data or to do something with it. I just like listening to it. I
Yes.
just
Yes, it must be amazing to wake up in the morning and to turn on your recording and have a little listen to who's visited during
Yeah,
the night.
it's a it is it's there's a great excitement about wondering who it was checked in, who flew over. There's
Yeah.
great excitement.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
This to me, I'm just flabbergasted by your story. This idea of wanting to connect, and it just keeps coming into my mind that this is a story of connection, and it's a connection between you and the birds, wanting to experience what they experience, wanting to make the same journey. And it's also a story of connection between countries and people in different countries, because we have this experience of sharing birds in a way, because the birds might summer in one place and winter in another place, and yet each country, I'm sure, considers them to be their birds, if you know what I mean. And so this story of connection
Yeah,
is so beautiful.
that's right. And but the reality is that, and that's one of the challenges that conservationists around the world have dealt
Yes.
with for years and continue to deal with, is that we have a world that's divided up with essentially arbitrary political, like,
Yes.
arbitrary political lines,
Mhm.
and birds. And that was another thing that I loved about this journey, is that there's no, they have no, they observed none of these boundaries, nor are they required to,
Yes.
obviously. But yeah, they some of the big parks in Africa, they try, and there's this concept of transnational parks because, like
Yeah, wow.
The Serengeti and the Masai, the Mara in Kenya and the Serengeti, they're essentially a transnational park that straddles geopolitical lines, because birds, animals, they don't observe that.
Mm-mm-mm. Yeah. I have a friend who's, an ornithologist in Spain, and he studies bird migration. It's very close to the Strait of Gibraltar, and in the same way that you said, uh,
The
that
funnel.
that thinning of the land
Yeah,
mass
yeah,
it can be a funnel for the birds, and he sees a lot of activity there, and then also works in North Africa and Senegal in particular. And it strikes me as something very beautiful that the birds connect countries. It connects people.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I'd love for you to tell the story of the banded Canada goose that connects you to someone in Greenland.
Yeah, so I live close to the Connecticut River, and the Connecticut River flows south. It's from pretty close to the Canadian border, and it empties into the Long Island Sound, just north of Long Island in New York. So it's a fairly long river, and it's oriented north south, which is, from a bird's perspective, is really important. If you're a bird heading north, birds have a number of tools that they use to migrate, and visual cues are one of them, especially for birds that fly during the day. And so geese migrate during the day and during the night. They use both diurnal and nocturnal migration, and so they use this river as a visual cue. And it's also it's a floodplain. It's got fertile arable land, and it's full of fallow fields and stubble fields where
Mm,
they can rest up and refuel. And so it's a pretty cool place to go birding. And so in spring and March, there are large flocks of geese heading north, and we have about 5 or 6 species of geese that migrate north through New Hampshire. A lot of them are Canada geese, and they may not be going that far north, maybe into southern Quebec. But there are other species, and even some Canada geese, that go farther north again. And one of the things about birds is it's really hard to know where an individual. You might know where a population is going, but you
mhm,
don't know where an
mhm.
individual is going. And the process of banding, I mean, they call it ringing in Europe. I'm not sure what the term in Australia is, but putting an
Banding, I
aluminium,
think. Mhm.
is it banding? Putting an aluminium or aluminum band on a bird's leg traditionally requires the bird be caught again, because you can't read the numbers. The value in a band
Mm-mm.
is tracking individual over space and time, and you can't read the numbers unless you recapture the bird. For large birds that can carry larger field readable bands like geese, they can put a neck collar on the bird, and it's field readable with binoculars or a telescope, so the bird doesn't need to be recaught, and it enables biologists tracking populations to get a much greater return. I don't know what the return rate for many songbirds, it's terribly poor return rate. That you might put on 1,000 leg bands and hope that one of them gets. I'm not sure what the return rate is,
Mhm.
but for field readable birds, it's a much higher, because birders out there with their telescopes will see a bird and report it in. So I was out on this spot on the river, and I saw, in amongst a flock of a couple of hundred Canada geese, this bird with a neck collar. And so I was able to get my scope out and read the neck collar numbers, GJN. And so I was like, this is cool, because immediately I saw that, I knew I had a story. There was a story here. I was going to be able to,
Yeah,
it wasn't just, seeing a bird, seeing a new species, getting a
yeah.
tick. It was like, there's a story here. I'll be able to find out where this bird came from. I'll be able to get a little bit of his life story. And so there's a portal, an online portal you can use in the US to submit this data. And I sent it in, and I got a return that it was a Canada goose that was banded in. There are so many lakes in Greenland, and it's so underpopulated that a lot of the lakes don't have names. They just have they have a very simple coding system, and so I can't remember what the name of this lake was. K something,
Mhm.
but it was
Mm.
a Canada goose that had been hatched from a nest next to this lake in Western Greenland, and I reached out to the biologist. I was able to through the website. I was able to find out who had banded it. I reached out to the biologist, and I got some background information on the. I got some really cool photographs of the chick actually being capped and banded, and then I was able to actually serendipitously I was able to I discovered that a fellow I knew from growing up in Ireland had been part of the banding expedition to ban this population
Wow.
of birds. So just small world story again, where
Mm-mm.
it's birds connecting people across space and time. So it's just really, really, just a really cool connecting event for
Yeah.
for a person living in New Hampshire to realize that, well, actually the connections between my state and Greenland, and then the same, years later to Colombia with the broad-winged hawks and Panama with the broad-winged hawks. It's where there's just the
Yeah.
connectivity is just insane.
It is. It's amazing. I had a really beautiful experience of this bird connection with a friend who I have made. We talked earlier about technology connecting people, and I've made a lot of friends in California, in all over the world. But the nature journal community is very active in California. And a friend of mine called Melinda, she lives in California. We've never met, but we're very close. And she studied sooty shearwaters, which are in fact a bird that connects us because they spend time in California, and they also have breeding colonies down here in New Zealand and Australia. And in fact, I was researching and I found that there's a breeding colony very near here. And the fact that these birds they cross the world, and the fact that we both know these birds, that we both experience these birds is beautiful. It's beautiful that we're connected in that way.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember seeing sooty shearwaters off the coast of Ireland. I've seen them off the coast of New Hampshire, and um, I mean, it's a big population, and they breed. The sooty shearwaters I know breed in the southern Atlantic also, so they're fairly well
Okay.
distributed in terms of a breeding
Yep.
population. But yeah, I mean, who knows that the one I saw in Ireland in 1999 may have been the same one you saw off the coast of Australia
Yeah.
a couple of years earlier. It's incredible.
I wonder about your own movement and how that was, because you were very close to the birds of Ireland, and I wonder about coming to know the birds of New Hampshire and what that was like to start again, to get to know a whole new set of friends, as it were. How do you begin to know the population near you?
Well, when I came to the US, I had just graduated from college in Ireland in zoology, and I was trying to figure. I came over here sight unseen. I had no job prospect or anything like that. We decided to come here, and not particularly well planned out. And there's a book called "What Color Is Your Parachute?" It's a very famous book for folks who are transitioning in careers. Going from one career to another. It's essentially about
Mm,
repurposing skills sets and trying to help you position yourself for new careers. And it talks about transferable skills. And the reason I'm going here is I think, to be honest with you, it's a transferable skill. And when I
mhm,
essentially it's a process of learning how to read birds both visually and hourly, by ear, by eye.
mhm,
And it doesn't really matter what continent you are. So the process of learning that skill in Ireland, I was able to pick up the stuff in the US really, really quickly. And if I was to go to a new
mhm,
continent, I think I'd be. It's. I had a friend in. I have a friend in the US, and he's not a birder, or at least he wasn't, but he's a musician. He's a trained musician, professional musician, and he picked up bird song to the extent that he was able to identify birds by ear incredibly quickly because his ear was trained
mm-mm,
for that. And so I think after a lifetime doing this, I predisposed to it. So it wasn't difficult for me in the US.
mm. And you've also worked as a land specialist for the Harris Centre of Conservation Education and led birding tours. And I wonder about the moment when you're taking someone out, you're leading a tour, and they have this realization that what they're seeing, what you're showing them, is actually quite astonishing. And I wonder how that feels about seeing the spark in someone else because your friend did that for you when you were young, suddenly switching that switch. And I wonder what it feels like to lead tours and see that happen in other people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do a lot of trip leading. It's got its own stress level that I try and
Mhm.
keep a low stress life. But I do a very limited number of trips out to islands off the coast of New Hampshire, and I love these islands, and so it's not a big ask for me to do them. And the reason I love going out there is because that phenomenon of migration is most visible. I talked about the broad-winged hawk migration and the reasons it's very visible in terms of that particular species. But it's a truism in general about migration that if you find restricted land masses on a migratory route, so that could either be an
Mhm.
island off the coast or it could be an island within a concrete jungle like Central Park in New York, you're essentially getting a magnification of, you've got the same number of birds flying north, but they've got a much restricted area to rest and refuel. And so, if you get the right place at the right time of year and you get the right weather events, you can just get phenomenal migratory events. And
Mm.
so, it's not actually when I go out to these places with people and the switch gets turned on, I'm not doing it. It's the birds that are doing it. I
Mm-mm.
don't take any
Yes.
ownership of that. And so, if you hit it
Mm.
right, so I pick the right time of the year and I pick the right place, and I hope for the best weather. And if it's the best weather, if the weather is conducive to a good migratory event, you've got people who live in an area that might not be prone to these migratory events, suddenly visiting an island during a fallout where there's hundreds of species of all shapes and sizes and descriptions in huge numbers, and they're just blown away. So you really don't have to do anything. But if it's quiet, then yeah, then it takes a little bit of excitement on my part to get people to tune in.
I wonder, you mentioned conservation or the barriers and difficulties of international conservation efforts, and I'm wondering about the best ways, the best things we can do to protect birds. Is it simply about habitat preservation, or are there things that we can do individually to help birds?
Oh, for sure, yeah. This is such a difficult area.
Mm.
I get so sad, really. I really get so sad when I think of where we are now in the year
Mm,
2023.
mm.
I get so sad. So, sure, I mean, there's so much we can do. And I guess, without getting into detail, the thing we can do is have as light a footprint on the planet as we possibly can. And
Mhm.
so, do you need that second car? Do you need that second
Mm.
house? Do you really need to have, three foreign vacations a year? Because it's about there are 7 billion of us. If there were 7 billion wildebeest on the planet, we would know about it. If there were 7 billion,
Yes.
we would. I mean, if there were 7 billion anything on the planet, we'd be like, "There's a real problem here. We've got a real problem.
Mhm,
It's a
mhm.
resource issue, and these 7 billion wildebeest are just tearing the place apart. We've got to do something about it." So we have a resource issue, and so to the degree that we can have as light a footprint on the planet as possible, it will be to the betterment of the animals that we share the planet with. And essentially, that's what it is. It's we share this planet.
Yes.
We're the dominant species, but we share it. And if we don't share it, they're going to suffer, and we're going to. And I hate to think of a world where I go out to Star Island off the coast of New Hampshire, where I lead these trips. I hate to think of a world where I go out there and there's no more birds, that the
Yes.
numbers aren't there. I hate to think of a future where, I tell my nieces and nephews, or great nieces and great nephews, yeah, I followed this
Mhm,
migratory
mhm.
route of broad-winged hawks south on a bicycle, and there were 3 million birds back in the year
Mhm.
2016. I don't I it's they will not thank us for that. So use less. You can go into specifics about birds,
Yes.
cats. Outdoor cats are a big threat to birds. Window strikes are a big threat. So the internet and various conservation bodies are full of do's and don'ts in terms of specific actions you can take. But the larger
Mhm.
picture is just resource use. Just leave a lighter footprint on the planet. So I drive a small car. I have one house, small house, and I'll leave it at
Mm.
that. I don't like to be a preach. I don't like to get preachy about it because people are going to do what they're going to do.
Yeah. But this whole idea about connection, this whole idea about stepping outside, taking a look, making a connection with another species, it helps that leap. It helps people. You say people will do what they do, but behavior is changed when we love something. Behavior is changed
Yeah.
when we're connected to something. Mm.
Yes. Yeah. It does. I mean, yes. If when we get to know something and get to understand something, then we get to care about it. And so,
Mhm, mhm,
to the degree that I mean, that's what I've done with my life. I
mm,
work in conservation, so I work in land protection, and then I do I do this other stuff that we're talking about on this podcast. And to the
mm,
degree that I'm helping, and I know I've done a little bit in my life where I've turned a few people on, I've sparked a few people, and so
mhm.
that makes that makes me feel good about getting up in the morning.
Yeah. Eric, your story is astonishing, and I'm so happy that you shared it with me today. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
You're so welcome, Beth. It's great to talk to you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Eric. Before our chat, I really had no idea about the different ways that Eric had connected with the migration route of the broad-winged hawks. I was totally amazed to hear about him following their route on a bicycle and then learning to hang glide and then the accident. I love that he's found a way to continue to connect with the process of migration through the nocturnal sound recordings and also through the writing project that he mentioned. I also love the thread of connection that runs through this story. Connection with birds and the incredible journey that they're able to make each year, and connection between continents and people. Please do visit the show notes of this episode to find the link to the video Nightsongs and also to Eric's website, where you'll be able to learn more about Eric, read his blog, and even find his book Birdwatching in New Hampshire. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.